Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 20-Minute Neighbourhoods Practitioner Network. I'm Ewan Leach. I'm the Chief Executive of SURF, and I'm hoping you can all hear me. I've had minor problems this morning with my internet connection, but it's now a cable network that I have. So thank you very much for joining us today. This is the third meeting of the network. And so far we have looked at some local approaches to 20-minute neighbourhoods, some citywide approaches to 20-minute neighbourhoods. We have also looked at Public Health Scotland's interaction with it and the role of the Place Standard and Scottish Futures Trust's approach to living well locally as part of their response to 20-minute neighbourhoods. So we've had a variety of presentations so far. And we were maybe going to have the third meeting at the end of last year, but we wanted to make sure that we were going to be discussing 20-minute neighbourhoods within the context of the National Planning Framework 4, or the draft NPF 4, which came out in December. So we held off having it until now so that everyone could have an opportunity to look at NPF 4. And one of the holes in our discussions around 20-minute neighbourhoods was the approach to applying the policy to rural Scotland. And last week, I took part in a workshop with Scottish Rural Action, looking at what this could possibly mean within a rural context, because we were aware that in the conversation up until now, it was something that had been I suppose absent in the discussions that we'd be having within this particular network. So I'm delighted this morning that we have Artemis Panna from SRA, and we have Fiona Simpson, the Chief Planner from Scottish Government, to talk about both those respective topics. So this morning we have two presentations. We have a Q&A, both will be followed by a Q&A, and I would ask you all to keep your microphones muted. Feel free to put your screens on if you would like to be seen, but we understand if you also don't want to be seen. And I will now hand over to Artemis Panna from Scottish Rural Action to give some feedback from the workshop that she and I both participated in last week. Over to you, Artemis.
Thank you, Ewan. I'm going to stop my video before I screen share. The perils of a rural location. Right, can everybody see that?
That's great, we can. Thanks, Artemis.
Okay. Thank you. So yes, well, thank you, Ewan, and all of you for the invitation today. I am going to launch in with a few basics, as I believe, as Ewan said, this is the first 20-minute practitioner network meeting since the publication of the draft NPF 4 document. So the Scottish Government, as we know, is committed to applying the 20-minute neighbourhood model on a national scale. Scotland's the only country in the world to have this ambition. Most countries stop at a citywide application. And one of two of the countries I've looked at include rural peripheries within this kind of citywide application, but they're rare. To apply what is effectively a place-based policy on a national scale, there is a need for inbuilt flexibility, really, in the definition and parameters. So it is indeed applicable to different places. And NPF 4 is therefore critical because it is the Scottish Government's first attempt at a universally, at least in Scotland, applicable definition and the parameters to flexibly interpret that definition, at least from a planning perspective. So on the slide is the definition and a statement to the confidence that the model may be adjusted to suit any geographic community. And both of these statements are from page 74 of the draft NPF 4 document. On the back of the publication of NPF 4 in its draft form, as Ewan said, SURF Scotland, Scottish Rural Action and the Scottish Rural and Island Transport Community brought together last week a small group of expert practitioners from across rural and island Scotland to test this definition and some of the parameters in NPF 4 against their own experiences of delivering on the 20-minute neighbourhood model. And my job today is to feed back what they said, and some of them I believe are in this meeting today, so will keep me right and hopefully add to the presentation. Right, Well, at face value, the practitioners at last week's meeting agreed that the strength of this definition is the fact that, like 20-minute neighbourhoods in general, the ideal is easy to understand and easy to buy into. Everyone gets it. At face value, many rural and island communities, and the photos of Stromness on mainland Orkney, could be a 20-minute neighbourhood. Stromness has lots of potential to do more as a 20-minute neighbourhood with a population of 3,000, some vacant, derelict and underused land and assets, active community anchor organisations, relatively well-established broadband and transport infrastructure, but I'm sure many people will contest that. Moving around rural and island Scotland, and the 20-minute neighbourhood model may, as MPF4 suggests, be adjusted for different geographic communities within each of the spatial strategy's 5 action areas. Moving around clockwise from the top, you have Huntly's Mobility Hub, a car club active travel centre serving part of rural Aberdeenshire. You have the Stedding, a converted derelict steading turned into community hub in Rosewell, Midlothian, which offers office space and space for local peripatetic businesses to come to the community, as well as a lot of other services. You have a farmers market in Galloway, helping to create denser local food networks, a mobile electric fish van in the Outer Hebrides, and a new build development in Gairloch, population 700 in Wester Ross, which includes 25 housing units, a farm shop, a tourist centre, and a University of the Highlands and Islands Learning Centre, amongst other services. With all these initiatives, creating compact and connected neighbourhoods is important. The distance of 800 metres, kind of less so, but all these initiatives contribute to the desired outcomes of 20-minute neighbourhoods, decreasing health inequalities, improving the local economy, addressing climate change, and improving the livability of a place. So yeah, less about maybe the absolute distance between people and services, though that is a good way of helping people visualize their living environment, and more about the quality of experience of the journey and the service itself. And this chimes very much with research done by Ramble UK for Climate Exchange that I know you're all familiar with. The research also highlighted that alongside the infrastructure itself and its quality, community participation is critical to successful 20-minute neighbourhood initiatives. How do you best engage people in designing and using 20-minute neighbourhoods and encouraging behaviour change where possible? So, for example, the adoption of active or public transport modes, the commitment to work from home or closer to home, buy local, and so on. So again, the examples practitioners gave in the previous slide are exemplars of public participation because they are exemplars of community-led local development. And in truth, if they, not all, and well, most of them were not designed necessarily with the 20-minute minute neighbourhood framework at the forefront of people's minds. They were designed based on community consultation for their intrinsic value. And then someone went, you know, this 20-minute neighbourhood thing could apply to what we're doing. Perhaps this opens doors for more resourcing. And this is really the nature of place-based bottom-up approach, which is very much a rural and island thing. And I'm not saying it's not an urban thing, it absolutely is. But the critical question is what happens when this bottom-up is lost? When the planning system or another top-down policy initiative says, we will design our country, we will design our places, we will make our decisions based on this model of a 20-minute neighbourhood that we understand and we see. So there's a risk that when that happens, things start looking a little less wholesome. We've talked about quality of experience and public participation as being critical to the 20-minute neighbourhood model. But if you're going to be realistic about it, then what 20-minute neighbourhoods are about is density, and specifically population density. This point was raised in another research piece by Douglas and Beautyman, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The link is on the slide. Douglas and Beautyman examined 20-minute neighbourhoods in an Edinburgh context. What they concluded is that you need to have a certain density of population to make the model economically viable, to attract services to a neighbourhood so people can meet most of their needs within this 800-metre walk or wheel, to create also more green space. And this can be achieved relatively easily in an urban environment. And the process of developing a 20-minute neighbourhood in an urban environment is a process of decentralization or localism, which is exactly the intended consequence of this policy. But when you take that model to rural and island communities, what can happen is entirely the opposite. the only place you can get the density for 20-minute neighbourhoods to work and be economically viable is in what we call hub villages. So applying the model nationally therefore risks centralising all services to a main village, while the satellite villages are cut off from each other and from development opportunities. Transport becomes unidirectional between satellites and the main village, or if you're in North Lanarkshire, perhaps between your village and Glasgow. So this centralisation is ruinous for community resilience and for local economies, and perpetuates negative population trends, including out-migration of younger people. And in this way, there's enormous potential policy tension between 20-minute neighbourhoods, Scotland's economic transformation strategy, and also Scotland's population strategy. Another critical tension arises in relation to the use of cars. Again, looking at the objective and the way that 20-minute neighbourhoods are portrayed, the approach that they take to protect the environment and improve livability is through designing places in a way that reduces the use and ownership of cars. Now, this is a necessary ambition for rural and island places, but it is also right now, due to lack of infrastructure, a completely unrealistic ambition. The pictures on this slide, including the very serious looking Kate Forbes, tell a story that is mirrored from Borders to Unst in Shetland. People have to use cars because either public and active transport is not available, or when they are available, as near Sconser, this is on the Isle of Skye, they're neither accessible nor safe. So the bus stop is a pile of shingles you struggle to walk or even stand on, even if you have full mobility. And cars travel down the A87 at more than 60 miles an hour, if we're going to be totally honest, because they're rushing to get to the ferry. This high school is actually a 25-minute bus ride away. So, you know, you could conceivably have an almost 20-minute neighbourhood scenario here, except that people will not use that bus. Again, policy cohesion becomes critical to 20-minute neighbourhood implementation. Under climate policy, the Scottish Government just launched for consultation the draft route map to achieve a 20% reduction in car kilometres by 2030. In it, intervention 2F commits Scotland to introducing a safer speed limit of 20 miles per hour, but only on appropriate roads in built-up areas. So not in rural and island Scotland necessarily. Another point discussed in depth at the practitioner meeting last week was the risk of national top-down approaches to 20-minute neighbourhoods, building rigidity into an already stretched planning system, making it more likely to focus on the perceived quick wins, bigger developments, volume house building, than the small but critical infrastructure that really makes 20-minute neighbourhoods possible in all communities, not just rural and island communities. This small but critical infrastructure includes things like better signage, proper lighting, public toilets, handrails, park benches. They are what makes the difference really between people having an 800-metre route to walk or wheel between their home and where they need to get to, and actually walking or wheeling rather than jumping into a car. And I'd like to say that really the only reason this infrastructure is not prioritised is because of tight budgets and a distraction, you know, with big shiny developments, but we all know that's not true. The real reason is systemic discrimination against the people who most benefit from these solutions: older people, people living with disabilities, and children. Their voice is not heard, they don't really matter. So we start to ask that question around 20-minute neighbourhoods as to whose 20-minute neighbourhood this really is. Bucking the trend, there's some great action research undertaken by Living Streets. I've added a link into this presentation. I'm sure you're all aware of it. I also wanted to add that micro solutions, and this was reflected in the conversations last week, go beyond planning and infrastructure to things like community transport initiatives and pop-up food stalls. These are small things that hit all the desired outcomes of 20-minute neighbourhoods, but frequently lose out on funding because they're quite difficult to capture and evaluate. Throughout all three previous narratives on centralisation, on car use, on park benches and other micro solutions, we've been looking at the spectrum of needs and expectations, and people absolutely expect to park their car within a metre of their front door, though they don't really need to. And conversely, they may not expect to access accident and emergency within 60 minutes if they live where I do on an island, even though they know it might be a life or death matter. So we can all make really basic assumptions that confuse need with expectations, and people, due to COVID, may expect door-to-door delivery services, and this is what Aberdeenshire Council initiated with a climate change friendly electric fleet of vans that deliver library books door-to-door and replace the mobile library service. But people want the mobile libraries back because it is a lifeline service. That's actually a newspaper article from 2 days ago. And it's a lifeline service for those who are socially isolated. So people might expect Amazon deliveries, but what they need is neighborhood and community, especially perhaps in rural and island areas. And sometimes, as we talked about, meeting expectations rather than meeting needs ends up eroding resilience. So a lot of care needs to be taken with that. But building on existing resilience, so neighborliness in rural and island communities opens doors. Things like car and lift sharing are likely to find strong roots in these communities. So I'm just checking the time. I think I've got time for one more quick anecdote before I wrap up. Again, something which was talked about last week. The city of Ottawa in Canada is looking more ambitiously than most regions at 20-minute neighbourhoods. They're including their rural peripheries. It is a city with rural peripheries. They just did a survey exploring what services people would want to see in a 15-minute neighbourhood. So I put that link in this slide. The findings were published in September 21. And one thing they found was that improving childcare in rural areas was critical to successful delivery of their 15-minute neighbourhood model. Now, the Scottish Government has already done a lot to improve childcare. It has increased nursery and preschool provision up to 30 hours per week for many 2-year-olds and all 3-year-olds. And this is a flagship policy just finished rolling out that undoubtedly benefits many, many thousands of parents and children and will do so into the future. And maybe Ottawa will learn from that and do the same. But here we pause because amongst all the good it has done and will do, it has also given rise to a terrible unintended consequence in rural and island areas. It has precipitated the closure of hundreds of tiny grassroots parent and toddler groups, which have either lost funding redirected to mainstream provision, or there are too few kids and parents attending to make them viable. So there immediately is a lifeline cut off for new parents and carers. And this all might sound depressing, a narrative of even with indisputably excellent policy initiatives, we cannot get policy entirely right. But really we can, because if we do anticipate negative outcomes and negative consequences, then we can absolutely act to mitigate these. So where does that leave us? Well, to be honest, the jury is out on whether 20-minute neighborhoods are appropriate for rural and island places. But there is also a sense that we are at the beginning, as Ewan said, of a really exciting journey rolling back 60 years of car-centric planning. But we do need a delivery plan for this journey and the right kind of resourcing that enables rural and island communities to build on opportunities. And there are many of these opportunities, as noted by practitioners last week. That includes better data, closed-loop car shares, smart clachens, infrastructure-related opportunities, micro-enterprise home working, and the community wealth building agenda. And how all these things are opportunities are a presentation unto themselves. So that's it from me, really. What I've verbally communicated in this presentation will be written up in a report and circulated to you together with the slides. I kind of want to leave you with a question that seems to be at the heart of every conversation we have around policy and rural, just gets more vexed every single day. But I'm also leaving you with a very big thank you from the partners who delivered last week's event.
Thank you very much, Artemis. Having been at the workshop, I think you have very sort of succinctly summarised the issues that were brought up at that workshop. So thank you very much. And I think the phrase that I took away from the workshop was the 20-minute neighbourhood policy is a decentralising one in an urban context, which is good, but potentially a centralising one in a rural context, which you really well illustrated there with diagrammatically. But I think some of the participants in the workshop are with us today. I don't know if anybody who was at the workshop wants to comment further on what Artemis has said before I open it up to the floor for some questions. I didn't warn you that I was going to do that, but if you don't have it, does anybody have questions specifically for Artemis? As she has said, we will be sharing the workshop report with the network. All the comments, Artemis, are very positive in saying that you've given a really clear account of the issues that were play, how thought-provoking it was. Bottom-up communities are crucial to delivering that. Is there anything else you would like to comment on, Artemis, that you haven't said within your 15 minutes?
No, other than potentially saying it's an enormous conversation, and I'm not an expert on it. So in a way, I'm glad that there are no probing questions. My job was to communicate what was talked about last week. And I really do hope through this network and through other forums that we can continue this conversation, because it was very valuable.
I mean, I think one of the points that you very clearly made was that the 20-minute neighbourhood concept is something that's beyond planning. It's around a whole series of national and local government decision making that needs to take place, and linking those together, which I suppose comes back to the status of NPF4 itself and being applicable to other government policies, and being the one that maybe should sit above rather than adjacent to some of these policies. I suppose some of the questions that are coming in, Nick Wright's asking what a delivery plan might look like. I think that's a rhetorical question. I don't know if you would, from memory, this wasn't really discussed at the workshop, but Sarah Tolley's asking, how can the 20-minute project combine with tourism? I don't know if you would have any thoughts on that, not from the workshop, but from your personal perspective.
I do actually, and it is certainly something that I think holds huge potential for rural and island communities. Something that Scottish Rural Action at the moment is working on with Senscott and others is a model of community-led tourism. And community-led tourism is when you hand the design of the local tourism offering to communities. So they primarily are designing places for the community, for families. What would families enjoy? Where would families enjoy living? And on the very correct assumption that it's that sort of authentic experience that a lot of tourists coming to Scotland are looking for anyway. So when you're initiating community-led tourism options and projects, then 20-minute neighbourhoods naturally become part of that, because you want tourists and local people to be able to access all these offerings and opportunities in sustainable and in easy ways. So yeah, there's a lot of links there, and Senscott, I'm aware, has just received additional funding to do more work in this area. So Sarah, what I can do is put you in touch with, or maybe you're already in touch with Sarah Cameron from Senscott, who is an absolute expert on this topic.
I suppose on that topic, I think one of the things that came up in our in the discussion, I suppose specifically with the contributor from Gairloch, from Gail, was the issue of centralising services within settlements in what are widely dispersed settlements of Wester Ross. It kind of will weaken the dispersion, and that some of the areas which already have maybe a high number of second homes or holiday accommodation, it exacerbates that, and that it becomes, these areas become increasingly appealing to people for second homes. Which maybe comes into a question that actually Stuart Hayes asking, is how big an issue is land ownership, cost availability in delivering this type of planning? I don't know if you have any thought on that, Artemis.
I do. Yeah, it is huge. I think that needs its own kind of network meeting to look at the links between 20-minute neighborhood and land, not just land perhaps, but also in asset ownership in general. And that ties in a lot with what we're talking about, the community wealth building agenda. So again, when you're looking at a particular policy area, one of the exciting things is to look at where else in the Scottish Government's narrative there are opportunities to strengthen the arguments that you want to make. And at the moment, Scotland's national strategy for economic transformation appears to be building itself on a community wealth building framework. And that's where you bring in all these discussions around community land ownership, asset ownership, and how that interacts with things like the 20-minute neighbourhood model.
I suppose planning often comes into play when someone decides they want to do something with land, and the people that decide they want to do something with land tend to be the people who own it. And so delivering this will depend on people changing things. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, Artemis. Ian Walls asked, what retail planning policies need to change?
I'm sorry, and that I don't know.
That's fine. We're not expecting you to know everything.
I could look into it.
We did discuss in the workshop, I suppose, the delivery of, I suppose, like your last slide illustrated around the call for the reinstitution of mobile libraries, in that retail has been delivered in a mobile way in rural Scotland, with people going to someone's house where our delivery van is, and the connections that is. How that would be changed through a policy mechanism, though, maybe is unclear to me. And I think actually, again, from Gail, I suppose the anecdotal feedback was a number of local retailers moving to a delivery system where they're delivering directly to people's houses in the same way that happens in urban Scotland.
There's also a lot of talk about dual shop fronts. So you have your physical shop front, and you also are supported to either yourself or in a cooperative to access larger markets online.
Okay, thank you. Nick Marshall's asking, defining needs rather than expectations. How do you do that while still basing priority on community participation? Have there been problems, or would you anticipate there would be problems? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Artemis.
I am a lot,
Yeah,
and that's why it's very difficult to kind of come back with a very quick response. I think one of the things, because I live on the Isle of Rassay, which is a small island of 170 people, I would like to say, you know, a relatively cohesive community where it's quite easy for us to have open conversations on some topics, maybe not all, around needs and expectations. Community development on our island is delivered very much through support from enterprise agencies like Highlands and Islands Enterprise. And I don't want to fault the support that we get from them, but a lot of their support is targeted, meeting the needs that is seen by the strategists within the Scottish Government or within HIE, and what they see as needs. So they will overlook perhaps initiatives that have social benefit or environmental benefit, but may not be particularly profitable. And they'll overlook that with a preference for initiatives that are definitely going to have a high turnover and will generate a lot of jobs and all of that, which is perhaps not what this community needs.
Okay, that actually in some ways answers there's a question from Stuart Douglas around the understanding of the discussion being centering on services infrastructure, but asking around the political structures that are required to underpin living well locally and democratic accountability. And I think that was certainly something that came up when we looked specifically at the policy and the application of policy, the concern that somebody making a decision remotely from the community where the decision is going to have an impact has consequences. And I suppose that ties in with what you just actually said there. Are we aware of any other rural case studies looking at how the 20-minute neighbourhood approach can be delivered in practice? Other than the improvement services analysis of Argyll off the top of my head, Artemis, do you have any other case studies that you can think of in a rural context?
And none that is, I would say, you know, publicly published, but we're hoping part of this continuing dialogue will involve collecting case studies similar to the ones that were in the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think, I suppose, one of the ones that was in the presentation was Drim, and we know that Drim is doing something, and it's specifically around food networks that they're doing some work on. And incidentally, one of the things they brought up was the closure of bridges locally is turning some areas of rural Scotland into island communities because they're losing their physical connections, their interconnectivity with areas surrounding them, which is about the maintenance of historic infrastructure. There's a longish comment from Nick Wright in the chat, who's doing some work with Sustrans. So there is some research going on. So that's obviously live, and Nick has given his contact details within that. So that's very helpful. Thank you very much, Nick. And the climate exchange research, which is the Ramble research, which I think Artemis also referred to, is within the links as well, and it's also on SURF's website. There's one question from Mark Dowie. I'm not going to pick up on that just now, Mark. I think it's a topic in itself, because Mark is asking, how do we meet the 20% car kilometres reduction in rural areas? Is it viable to do so given the current public transport system? Public transportation in rural Scotland was a major discussion point at that workshop, as I think Mark knows, because Mark was there. And that certainly is something that I think for us as a network of practitioners, we should be looking at next as a topic for discussion to see how that's delivered, because rural Scotland is dependent on the car, and as Artemis said, in the short term, there's no actually realistic option other than being dependent on the car. Artemis, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in the workshop that we held last week. It was really rich content that we got from that, so I look forward to the report, and as I've said, we'll share the report with this network as well. So thank you, Artemis. Artemis will be staying with us, so if you have other questions for Artemis, we can come back to them towards the end of this morning. But now I'm going to hand over to the Chief Planner, Fiona Simpson, because I think we've all been talking about 20-minute neighbourhoods for quite some time. I think they've been referred to in policy context for at least the past 2 years within Scotland, and obviously we saw them appearing in manifestos last year. But the NPF4 is kind of the main place we've begun to see them fleshed out in terms of a concrete description of them, something that we know will be providing longevity to it, as NPF4 is for 10 years. And so now is an opportunity for us to hear about that. And SURF will be doing a response to the consultation on draft NPF4. And so the discussion of today will also help us think about that. So thank you very much for joining us, Fiona, and over to you. I think Emma is going to share your presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and hopefully Emma can get my slides up and running. So thanks very much for the invitation to speak today, and actually that was really interesting to hear from Artemis as well. A lot of really interesting nitty-gritty points there, so I'm sure we can revisit further in the conversation we've got coming up. So I'm really happy to be talking about this subject today, because it really has significant potential to be supporting a wide range of important objectives from across Scottish Government policy areas. And what I want to do in my presentation is really think about the rise of 20-minute neighbourhoods as a concept, and how that can help us to meet our local place-based aspirations, and how they link to the wider strategic objectives we have around climate, health and well-being, and recovery from COVID. I'll then give you an overview of the draft NPF4 and our draft policy approach, I want to also touch on the importance of local development plans, and I'll touch on local place plans as well as part of that, and conclude with some final thoughts. Next slide, please, Emma. Okay, so no, I'm very conscious that many of you are putting an awful lot of thought into 20-minute neighbourhoods, and will know a lot of what I'm going to cover today, but I'll try to add some value by giving you a slightly different perspective. And I think it's important to step back a bit and think a little bit about a couple of places to illustrate the concept and think about what that means in practice. So obviously there's places throughout Scotland that weren't built recently at all, where you can see how the principles have really shaped how they were planned and how they've evolved over time. For example, Inverary in Argyll, it brought together homes for workers with jobs like a woolen mill and a pier and services, including churches, a blacksmith, a courthouse, a jail, a bank, when it was planned. And it looks like a coherent place as well, using design principles and responding really well to its natural setting. And then closer to my own home in Knightswood, in the 1920s in Glasgow, the aim was to build 6,000 homes, but the planned approach was inspired by garden suburbs and incorporated green space, whether that's large or small, 8 churches, community halls, 4 shopping centres, 6 schools, and even a 9-hole golf course. So I'd argue that the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods is really good common sense and should be in every planner's DNA. But it's fair to say that these principles didn't always carry on in plans and redevelopment in the latter half of the 20th century. And it's these places that could perhaps benefit the most from the application of this concept. Emma, next slide, please. But over the last couple of years, the stars have really aligned for 20-minute neighbourhoods in Scotland and internationally, and everyone seems to be talking about them now. And in September 2020, in response to the global pandemic and the climate emergency and the 20-minute neighbourhood ambition, where people can live well locally and meet their daily needs within a 20-minute walk, wheel or cycle from their home, was really written large in the Scottish Government's programme for government. And in setting out a commitment to 20-minute neighbourhoods, there was increasing recognition that if we're to achieve our climate ambitions and our net zero targets, we need to adopt a green recovery and to find a way out of the pandemic in a way that was allowing us to radically rethink the places where we live, our homes and our communities. So many of the changes in the behaviours, including altered work patterns that we had, reduced car use, more appreciation for green spaces and for living more locally, that emerged during 2020 and went on into 2021 to some extent, have really beneficial impacts on the environment, but also for health and well-being. So there's never been a better time really to be thinking about this. And the delivery of 20-minute neighbourhoods has been supported by our place-based investment programme, which is now being rolled out in partnership with COSLA. So there's a route there between a concept and a commitment to delivery. Next slide, please. And the 20-minute neighbourhood is also being recognised across a wide policy landscape within Scottish Government. So the Climate Change Plan update in December 2020 recognised its role in helping us to transition to net zero. Housing 2040, really important document relating to our future homes, recognises the importance of our homes in contributing to quality of place. The Town Centres Review and a new future for town centres highlights the importance of mixed uses and diversity and providing positive outcomes for people and places. And of course, the National Planning Framework has been in preparation for around 2 years, and 20-minute neighbourhoods has increasingly played out within it. Because NPF4 could really play a key role in taking what is essentially an idea or a concept or a way of thinking, depending on where you're standing, and actually thinking about how it applies in practice. Last November, or the November before actually, this is strange times with the pandemic, but we published our position statement for NPF4, and it set out our intention to support living well locally through 20-minute neighbourhood concept being applied. And we found a lot of support for that in the responses to the consultation that we received. And then more recently, last November, in 2021, we laid in Parliament the draft NPF4, and that sets out how we think we could support that concept being applied in practice with some draft policy wording. And of course, we're now consulting on this, so it's great to hear that people are giving really close thought to the draft of NPF4, and we'll be responding to the consultation. Next slide, please. So for those who are less familiar with it, the Draft National Planning Framework 4 is a long-term spatial plan that sets out a vision for Scotland in 2045. It sets out a spatial strategy that is national, but which also sets out the variations in the contribution to that overall spatial strategy across different parts of Scotland. It sets out national planning policies, so because National Planning Framework 4 has a new statutory status as part of the development plan in the planning system, we had to revisit all of the planning policies that were set out in the Scottish planning policy and bring those together with the spatial strategy to look at how policy could help to deliver on the spatial aspirations that we'd set out in the NPF. So we've revisited all of our policies, and we've taken into account a wide range of changes and the changing context since the SPP was published. Sorry, I think something's happened with the slides. That's fine. So overall, with NPF4, it's really about taking a place-based approach, and that's quite a tricky balance to strike. So this is a national document. It relates to Scotland as a whole, but as you're all very aware, Scotland is a highly diverse place. So we've tried to provide a framework and some strike the right balance between having very clear and consistent policies, but also providing a framework within which local policies or local development plans and local place plans can flourish. Next slide, please. So just to go into that a wee bit more, the first part of Scotland 2045, the National Planning Framework, brings together the document as a whole, and it sets out the National Spatial Strategy, and that's illustrated very broadly here. And there's 4 key themes that underpin the strategy as a whole, but also which flow through to policy content later on in the document. So sustainable places, net zero, nature positive places, which are more adaptable and resilient to future climate change. Livable places, so this is really about taking a people-centred approach and setting out how our homes and our neighbourhoods can be healthier and more vibrant places to live. And the policy on the 20-minute neighbourhood sits within that section. Productive places, supporting a wellbeing economy is a key theme that flows again throughout the document as a whole, and it's aiming to also ensure that planning plays its part in helping to enable future investment in Scotland in a way that captures the benefits from community wealth building. And finally, distinctive places. So NPF4 recognises the distinctive agendas for urban and rural development, and the importance of protecting the natural and built environment as well. So working with our places, responding to those places is something we try to draw out within that particular section. So the 20-minute neighbourhood concept has the potential to bring all of these things together and to look at places in the round and to help us to understand the dynamics of how our places support the way that we want to live. Next slide, please. So the spatial strategy as well is underpinned by 6 spatial principles that we believe will best ensure that future development is sustainable. And this really draws on all of the themes that we heard from the early engagement and are thinking about not just the spatial strategy, but the policies that would take forward the spatial strategy. And all of these principles are potentially relevant to 20-minute neighbourhoods. In particular, the emphasis on compact growth, so limiting urban expansion, using brownfield, vacant and derelict land and buildings to make the best use of the land that can support us to live in a more sustainable way. But also local living, so creating places, better places for people, and supporting the way that we live on a day-to-day basis. Again, that people-centric approach. But others are also relevant, so conserving and recycling assets, so making the best use of our land and building, and minimising waste, urban and rural synergies, so recognising the needs and synergies between urban and rural Scotland, and the distinctiveness, obviously, between the two. And a just transition, ensuring that we don't exacerbate or create inequalities as we transition to net zero. So again, 20-minute neighbourhoods is potentially relevant to these spatial principles and could be the glue that brings a lot of these principles together and applies them to our places. So part 3 of the draft NPF 4 sets out our national planning policies, and obviously we're seeking views on these at the moment, and in particular, sorry, if you want to move back to, policy 7 on local living is a core part of our response to the calls for 20-minute neighbourhoods to feature strongly in the draft NPF 4. And the first thing to note about that is that the policy recognises the importance of local development plans in supporting the principle in practice, and it highlights the need also to adapt the concept to rural areas. And it really recognises that across the country, the application of 20-minute neighbourhoods will vary and will need to reflect local circumstances. And the policy aims to provide a sort of core, a starting point really, and a core statement on what the key principles and considerations are when you're thinking about 20-minute neighbourhoods. And I won't go through all of the list of considerations there, but it aims to capture the links between how you move about, what you need to use on a day-to-day basis, where you live, and how all of those come together in its most simple way of expressing it. Next slide, please. But it's important to look beyond. It's about more than policy 7 in the draft NPF 4, and the wider policies in part 3 are also arranged to support the 4 overarching outcomes of the spatial strategy. And some of these policies are entirely new, like the 20-minute neighbourhoods policy. Some are revised from previous versions, and including the Scottish planning policy, and the degree of change varies, but all of them have been rewritten basically because the National Planning Framework will play a different role in the system as part of the development plan. But the same spatial principles run across all of these policies in NPF 4. For example, there's a new policy on climate, and that's recognising the critical importance of planning in helping to support the transition to net zero. There's a new policy on community wealth building. There's updated policy on design. There's substantially rewritten policy on housing, a new policy on infrastructure first. Town centres and retail has been revisited, taking into account the town centre review. We've strengthened our policy on green infrastructure and introduced new policy on play. And we've also strengthened our policy on active travel and linked with the National Transport Strategy 2 and its sustainable transport hierarchy. So there's a lot in that. But I think the main message here is to think, when you're thinking about 20-minute neighbourhoods, yes, think about policy 7, but also consider the policies in the round and how they interact with one another. And that's what we've been trying to do as we've been working through the draft. Next slide, please. I want to also highlight the importance of development planning guidance and local development plans in all of this process. And we've got draft guidance along with draft regulations, and that's currently out for consultation at the same time. And we see local development plans as being a key area for where the principles are applied to places. The idea behind what we're doing is to some extent streamline the system. So if we have a national planning framework that's part of the statutory development plan, it should mean that local development plans don't have to repeat policies if they want to apply them in the same way across their area. although there is scope for local development plans to decide that their context is different and they want to introduce locally tailored policies, and that would be looked at the evidence report stage for preparing a local development plan. But we're really keen to do that, and that's not about centralisation, that is about allowing local authorities to then focus more on place-based approaches and to have a really tailored and spatial approach to development in their area. And local place plans will also be emerging, and we expect them to also play a crucial role in helping to establish what local livability looks like in different areas, and for that to inform the local development plan. So the draft guidance expects plans to be informed by the place principle. The local development plan evidence reports should be looking at how well neighbourhoods function and whether 20-minute neighbourhoods already exist within the plan area and whether there are any gaps. And the aim is for the spatial strategy to build on this by looking at the concept and thinking about the concept when allocating land for development. And in doing that, to encourage a mix of uses, to encourage density where it's appropriate, or hubs where that might work better, providing access to employment, community wealth building, looking at how you can repurpose buildings and land, and take an infrastructure first approach, stimulate active travel, blue-green infrastructure, play and space to socialise. So it sounds like a lot, and there is a lot that local development plans will have to take into account, but the aim is to bring together all of these considerations and apply them in a way that is relevant to that place. Community engagement in the preparation of local development plans will also be really important and features within the guidance, and we'll be having more guidance on effective community engagement in development planning coming forward. And that's including not only through the local place plans, but through the process of actually preparing the evidence report and putting together a spatial strategy within the plan. And that reflects the fact that communities are so well placed to understand how their places work now and how they want to see them work in the future, that it's essential that that's built into the planning process. So 20-minute neighbourhoods, again, at an LDP level, will bring together a wide range of policy areas, be informed by community views, and hopefully apply the concept to the plan area as a place. Next slide, please. So just in terms of some final thoughts to finish off on, we think 20-minute neighbourhoods have really significant potential to contribute to a wide range of strategic objectives, and their delivery will depend on really effective place-based collaboration. So planning has a really important role to play in this, but it's not the only service, and I think we've touched on that already in the earlier discussion. It is about the development and use of land in the long-term public interest, but it's also about thinking about how an area works as a place and how planning can respond to that and improve that place in the future. So we see a central or coordinating role for planning, and that starts at National Planning Framework 4 with policy support and hopefully synergies between the policies. Local development plans will have a really important role to play in bringing forward place-based responses. Local place plans can bring a community perspective together with wider engagement. The key message here for me really is this is a shared concept, but we recognise that it has to be place-based when it's applied in practice, and hopefully NPF4 gives a strong but flexible framework to help achieve that. So that's me finished. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That was a great overview, and obviously builds on what we've already heard prior to that around it being part of a raft of policies that need to be that this applies to, not just within the planning context. So if anyone has any questions, please also raise your hand. It doesn't need to be my voice that we hear all the time asking the questions, so feel free to use the raise hand facility or put them into the chat box. I suppose one of the questions that I was going to ask you first, Fiona, was a question that we've received in advance of this. The other places that have kind of led on the 20-minute neighbourhoods particularly Paris and Melbourne, have really focused on density and increasing densities to deliver 20-minute neighbourhoods. And I think that came out also in Artemis's presentation around the Rambo research, or around actually the improvement services research within, I think that was an Edinburgh context she used as an example. I don't know how you would respond to, because density is referred to in NPF4, but not necessarily explicitly, I think, within policy 7 on 20-minute neighbourhoods.
Okay, so I think density could be important, and it has an important role to play, in ensuring sustainable service provision and thinking about how places work in a more sustainable way in the future. But it's not the only solution, and I think the key message here is about place-based solutions. So what works in one part of Scotland, in particular in urban areas, may not work in a rural area, and I think we recognise that. And it's about finding solutions that respond to context. So we're trying to achieve that, and we've made explicit reference within the draft policy to this working differently in different areas. But we're not seeking to prescribe that. We're seeking to provide a framework within which innovation can come forward. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. I mean, one of my other personal observations around this is that I think 20-minute neighbourhoods are easy for the public to get their head around, actually, as a concept. The details of it is maybe more challenging, but the concept, and one of the reasons I say that is because we have already received questions from the public around planning applications that they're currently happening near them, that they are able to point at and say, that isn't a 20-minute neighbourhood, which is our response is, this is not SURF's job to support you in objecting to this. It's maybe something you take and go to PAS. But it is interesting that I think the public can see where a 20-minute neighbourhood doesn't exist quite easily. So I think that's something that will be interesting to see actually as this rolls out, how decision makers respond to that, where the public are able to see something that isn't conforming to policy. We have a hand up from Matt Lowther. Matt, do you want to ask Fiona your question?
Yeah, I'm just trying to start my video. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, yeah. We can't see you, you're white. Okay. You're just a white box just now. Okay.
As long as you can hear me, that's fine. So thanks very much, Fiona. That was really helpful. I suppose I work for Public Health Scotland, so I've got a particular interest in public health outcomes. So I think NPF4 is fantastic. I think it says a lot of the right things around health and public health. So it's really quite exciting, I think, from a public health perspective. I wanted to ask Fiona, I suppose, just to, and obviously not being a planner, a bit around the governance around the local development plans and how these things are signed off. So who's making sure that the local development plan is actually going to do and say all the right things that have been described in NPF4? So how are, I suppose, the local authorities held to account for having the local development plans set in place in terms of the national planning policy? So apologies if that's a bit of a naive question, but as I say, I'm not a planner. I'm not a planner. I'm a public health expert. So.
Hi, Matt. Okay, so local development plans, without sounding flippant, it is for all of us to make sure the local development plan says what it should say. So local authorities are primarily responsible for, or planning authorities are responsible for preparing local development plans, but engagement throughout the process of preparing the local development plan is really important. Beyond that, in the 2019 Planning Act, we made some changes which mean that the local development plan has to be signed off by full council, and it also has to align with the local outcome improvement plan as well, and that those changes are aiming to secure corporate buy-in to the local development plan. It's really about recognising that local development plans are about places, and places, absolutely planning is about place, but so is an awful lot more than that. And the place principle means that we should all be working together to support their delivery. So those changes aim to secure that wider buy-in. in terms of how it goes through the process in terms of governance, the arrangements for examination are still there as a result of the 2019 Act. So obviously there's that further check at the end of the process around how the local development plan sits within the framework provided by the National Planning Framework as well.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Questions coming in the chat box as well as hands going up. Judy Wilkinson's asking an interesting question around, in new developments, how do you get community engagement in the local development plan and local place plan when there is no local community there that exists? I don't know if you have any solution to that, Fiona.
Well, it's about context, isn't it? So nowhere exists in a vacuum, so there will be existing communities around the area. But yeah, no, it's a fair point. You've got if you're doing a large housing development and you don't have any residents yet, you can't see what they want to put in. But I think that's why it's so important to make sure that people often respond or get engaged in the planning system when there's a planning application to respond to or react to, and it's an illustration of why it's so important to get involved in the local development plan when it's being prepared. So the policy framework is there. You might not know where developments will come forward in the future, but setting the parameters and the policies and the spatial approach as early as possible in the local development plan is crucial.
Thanks very much. You know, one of the questions that's come in, actually, this also came up in the Rural Action workshop, was around the impact of working from home and the decentralisation of employment spaces, which I think, in sort of, from a town perspective, all the rhetoric I've heard about that has been it's positive for towns, and we've actually seen in cities the negative impact of the pandemic on city centres, but on local centres or in towns, there's been there's maybe been a benefit. But are we thinking anything more about the impact of working from home? Because I think in the Rural Action workshop, the topic that came up was if people have good internet access, there is the ability to work from home remotely in remote parts of Scotland, but it's also meaning that people will travel much further to hubs. So there's a sort of downside to that, in that they need autonomous transport to make what are much longer journeys to a place of work, maybe on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And I don't know if as a team you're doing much thinking around the impact of the sort of decentralisation and remote working, and how that maybe ties in with the NPF4.
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's pretty dynamic, and it's quite early to say actually, you know, how that will play out. And again, it's an illustration of how we've tried to provide some flexibility within the draft policies, so that policies can evolve and to think about that. But yeah, the changing dynamics, it will depend on the place as well. But that's something that we'll see playing out over time. But for 20-minute neighbourhoods, I think it's a huge opportunity. You know, even within cities, yes, there's impacts on city centres, but then there's also positive impacts on neighbourhood centres. You know, cities are often collections of villages. So that emphasis on neighbourhood centres and some of the changes in the local business that we're seeing, and people using their own immediate surroundings more, is a great illustration of the 20-minute neighbourhood in a urban context. And remote working and home working can support that. I think there's probably going to be a very rich literature around, you know, what happens with home working, remote working going forward. You know, what are the good bits that we can keep post pandemic, and you know, which you know, what do we want the office to be used for? All of these things, and really interesting questions that we don't have all the answers or data to, but we've certainly had an opportunity to think differently about our places and our neighbourhoods as a result.
And I think that would be echoed by the Carlos Marinas research within Paris, is creating local work hubs within neighbourhoods so that people don't have to travel across Paris for work, but they can actually work locally. But I suppose, as you said, it's dynamic. The reporting in the press today around the office market in Edinburgh is that last year was an absolutely fantastic year for deals being made in new office space at the same time as we're all wondering, will the office remain the way we're used to? But it is a dynamic situation. Stuart, hey, you have your hand up, and you have I think a question which is the same one that's in the chat. Is a good question. It's one that I've posed at some presentations I've made on 20-minute neighbourhoods. Stuart.
Yeah, thank you. This is Stuart Hay, Living Streets. This is sort of based on our experience. We've looked at a number of new developments, and we've looked at the policy, and there's a massive disconnect. And I suppose the fear is the MPF on the face of it looks really good, what it's saying, but will it actually be delivered in practice? Because we've just never managed to crack this at local level in terms of putting in infrastructure, public transport for walking and cycling. It's just not there, and it's still not there in developments. And this is policy going back 25 years since I was a planning student. So what will change, I suppose, with this? Is it tough enough to actually make that shift?
So Fiona, Stuart's question, I suppose, because this was some of the work that I've done presentations for Heriot Watt, looking at the past 20 years of Scottish planning policy. And like you began at the beginning by saying, 20-minute neighbourhood isn't new, and we've been in since 2000. Mixed use, walkable neighbourhoods have existed for quite a long time, and as Stuart said, they've not cracked it. So the question is, for 20-minute neighbourhoods, what's going to be different about the implementation of this?
Okay, so there's a few things. So first of all, National Planning Framework will be part of the Statutory Development Plan. So that's a different status to MPF3 and SPP. So that means that decisions need to be made in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So we'll be part of that plan. So that's important to bear in mind. But I think the broader thing is that the climate emergency, the experience we've had with COVID, the emphasis on health, our collective work to recover, are really big drivers and really substantial shifts in how we're thinking about things. MPF4, the draft, really aims to respond and to change quite significantly some of our policies in response to those big challenges. So I think, there's a lot of support for that, and, I would include local authorities and a wide range of other parties in supporting that overall shift that we're trying to achieve. So I think MPF4 could be a game changer, but it's only part of a system and it does need to be implemented. The other part of it is how we're changing the planning system itself. We're moving from 5-year plans to 10-year local development plans. And the purpose of that is partly around preparing a plan, but then focusing more on implementation and delivery. And that's certainly the space we want to get into within planning and architecture division around preparing the national planning framework and then working with others to support its delivery. And we would hope to see that also through local development plans. But, ultimately, local development plans, it's not about a checklists or a checkbox exercise. You can't have policies that will completely rule in or rule out things, but you can have a strong guide and a clear shared commitment to delivering on our strategic objectives like net zero. I hope that helps.
Thanks. I hope it helps too, because I think the concept is clear, but it is the application and delivery of it that I suppose people are maybe questioning. We have a series of questions that are actually all around something very similar, and it builds on stuff that Artemis has said, and it's around local governance, accountability around the local aspect of a 20-minute neighbourhood as a concept. And it's asking actually quite big, significant questions around our governance within Scotland, and that if it is local people that are best positioned to understand how a place works, I suppose some of our local authorities, Highlands would always say they're as big as Belgium, Argyll and Bute would say they've got a coastline as long as France. The size of some of our local authorities and where the decision makers sit within that maybe acts as a brake to the delivery of what is locally identified as a need, or how places are experienced and felt. I don't know if you have any comment on that, because I suppose it's about the mechanisms for these being delivered when councils are maybe seen as too remote from their communities due to restrictions within, sometimes within councils themselves. Do you see that as a barrier at all?
No, I think, you know, I take the point that's being made, but I think, you know, within the planning system, and I can only speak about the planning system and how that works. You know, we've got various levels at which you can get engaged. You know, an individual can absolutely, and we would encourage people to get involved in our national level strategy, right through to through regional spatial strategies, through the local development plan. We've now put in place local place plans, which could you know, happen at any scale and must be taken into account when a local development plan is being prepared. So it's about nesting all of that together, and you know, sometimes things will pull in different directions, but I would hope that by introducing local place plans, we're recognising the importance of community-led input to the local development plan and to wider thinking. So yeah, I just think it's a really important, you know, thing to emphasise, that planning reform as a whole is recognising the need to engage with people and communities, and to do that in an effective way, and to diversify really who we engage with, so that a wide range of people feel able to contribute to shaping the future of their places. I know that sounds high level, but it is a firm commitment that we want to see throughout the planning system. I mean, there's more to come. We'll be looking at more guidance around all of this. And again, you know, we'll be able to move into that supporting implementation and encouraging innovation once the new system is in place and the national planning framework's in place, and we move on to support delivery.
I suppose you've referred to this earlier, but Kate just has asked a sort of question around that sort of relationship between LOIPs, local place plans. She's maybe made the point that some local place plans are maybe too big for some communities to handle, but I know that the local place plan guidance doesn't actually define how large a local place plan has to be, but if a community doesn't have the capacity, that's obviously an issue, and for deprived communities, that's even more of an issue. Could you speak a wee bit more about the relationship between local place plans and local development plans and the local outcome improvement plans? Okay, so yeah, so the local place plans can be at any scale or geography, and it's about the community defining for themselves what they want their area to cover. They have a really important role. They actually came from the independent review of the planning system that was undertaken 2015 to 2016, which found that there was a lot of good work going on at community level through things like charrettes, but some of that work wasn't necessarily finding its way, or there wasn't an easy mechanism to bring that into the local development plan. So local place plans are there to really provide a vehicle for people working together. We've tried to keep the provisions and the guidance as light touch as possible, because it's not about Scottish Government telling communities how to plan for their own place. You know, communities can do that without us telling them what to do, certainly. But it's about providing a tool that people can use that has a way into the planning system. So those local place plans will feed into the mix in a local development plan. They have to be taken into account when they're being prepared. We've had some questions about what happens if you've got an LDP in place and then a local development plan, a local place plan comes forward. That is something that can be looked at by the local authority, and if they feel it raises significant issues, it may be one of the reasons why they choose to update their plan in part within the plan review cycle. So again, there's that flexibility, but it's really a tool that we feel could really help people to proactively and positively engage in the planning system rather than planning being done to them. They are part of preparing the plan for their area. In terms of support for authorities,
it's not about having a dedicated fund for local place plans. It's about helping communities access the resources that are available across a wide range of different portfolio areas that might help them with that. We hope guidance will help as well. We're often finding, communities are far more inventive than we would be about how they want to take forward plans for their own area. So, and I'm sure that good practice will grow and emerge over time, and there'll be sharing of good practice on this. So I think it's a really exciting space for planning to work within. It's only part of the way that people can get involved in the planning system, but I think it's a really important change to the system as a whole.
Okay, thanks very much. So you've addressed Emma's question there around funding for local place plans. So there's not a dedicated government stream for that, but there's maybe other areas about that communities can access it if they're wanting to, if they need funding for a local place plan. Grant Baxter's asked a question around, which is not strictly about 20-minute neighbourhoods, but is relevant to about the move away from how we stop greenfield housing or development on greenfield sites. And I suppose that maybe taps into some of the wider discussion around NPF4, around the fact that with NPF4 there's a lot of things should happen in NPF4, and maybe there are some things that maybe require musts. And I don't know if you want to respond to Grant's question around how we make brownfield be the first port of call for redevelopment.
Okay, so hi Grant. So we've strengthened our policy on brownfield land, and we've got a new vacant and derelict land policy in the NPF, and we've tightened the requirements around greenfield development. So we've been quite clear that's got an important role to play as part of a more sustainable spatial strategy overall. Obviously, there will be some exceptions around that, but we've tried to be quite clear that we expect to see a shift. We've had quite a lot of questions on the use of the words should and must within the National Planning Framework. And just to clarify, so should, we think is a strong word in policy. It's a policy that we've used in the Scottish planning policy and in the individual SPPs that preceded the consolidated Scottish planning policy. So should is, carries a lot of weight. Must, we just confine ourselves to using must when it's a statutory requirement or a legal requirement. So should applies to everything else. And then there's softer language within there around, consideration can be given, that sort of thing. But all of that, aims to achieve the right level of flexibility, but I wouldn't underestimate the power of should in the National Planning Framework. It carries a lot of weight. Okay,
thank you very much. I suppose the way it's, I suppose the test of it is often an appeal, and I suppose it's looking at how reporters often understand the application of planning policy, and I suppose in the future, some of us will be examining how reporters respond to appeals that refer to NPF4 and the status that the highlight is the heightened status that planning policy, Scottish planning policy now has because it's within NPF4. I think that's all the questions that we've had in the chat. If nobody else has got their hand up, I don't think I'm sorry if I've missed any of these questions. I know we've had some people put things into the chat box. Thank you very much to links to, there's a planning democracy workshop on NPF4, and there's also a series of webinars that Living Streets are having on the topic of walkable neighbourhoods. So these will be also in the minutes after the meeting. We'll put them on the website along with this presentation, these presentations. Stuart's obviously questioned the use of should hasn't managed to deliver things in the past, so it has been a word that's used in Scottish planning policy in the past, but it's maybe not been strong enough, which is maybe why people are coming back to the fact that there may be some things, some policies that we maybe want to decide are musts. Are there any more questions from anybody in the audience? I don't want to. It's 20 past. We have a few minutes left. But if there's no more questions, thank you very much then to our presenters, to Fiona and to Artemis. They were excellent presentations. You've had thanks noted within the chat, but thanks from all of us. You get a round of applause if we were in a room. People can use the emoji if they wish. But as I think both have referred to, it's it's an ongoing discussion around 20-minute neighbourhoods, and we are continually learning a lot. Thank you very much to Artemis for the link to the research in Ottawa. I'll be having a look at that after this. And I think there's also a book out by a Glasgow journalist on the 15-minute city, which I have just picked up from a bookshop, which I think will be bringing together a lot of the work that's been done globally on it, possibly giving an overview. I will have a look at that. If it's a good book, I'll recommend it, and I'll put that on a recommendation on our website as well. And I think for future 20-minute neighbourhood events, I think some of the thing that has come up repeatedly in our discussions are things around public transport, particularly when it comes to the 20-minute neighbourhoods outside of our cities. And it certainly came up within our conversation with Natalie, and an event that Natalie Thompson held in Midlothian around the connection between settlements that are close to cities, and that very often public transport leads you to the city and not between settlements. And I think that will certainly be a future topic that we will need to explore. But in the meantime, I would like to thank everyone for their presentations and to the really great questions that we had coming in from the audience. And it's 11:20. We're finishing early, so you've all got 10 minutes to do something lovely with. Hopefully it's as sunny with you where you are as it is with me today. And thank you very much for your time.